Hello, I'm Richard Campbell, Vice President of Policy and Research at Crest Forum. It is my pleasure to introduce the next panel, Increasing U.S. Competitiveness and Energy Security Through Trade. American resources play a major role in reducing global emissions. Our panelists today will discuss how the U.S. can leverage its trade policies to increase our global competitiveness while reducing global emissions. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Zan Fishman, Director of Energy Policy and Carbon Management at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Welcome, Zan.
Hello, everybody. It is really exciting to be part of National Clean Energy Week. And we get to talk about trade and the intersection of energy and climate policies, security, and the trade flows going, out of the U.S. into the U.S. It's a really interesting new space. I'm Zan Fishman from the Bipartisan Policy Center. And we are always looking for what are the policies that can advance good energy and climate policy and be bipartisan at the same time. And we've seen a lot of interest in this intersection between climate and trade. There's a lot of congressional leadership. We've seen leadership from Republican Senators Cassidy and Kramer, from Democratic Senators Coons and Whitehouse. On the House side, we've seen Democratic Congressman Scott Peters. We've seen Republican Congressman John Curtis. A lot of excitement around this policy area. And I'm really excited that we have a terrific panel today of experts. I'm going to ask them a lot of specific questions, and we're going to get some specific answers because, one of the things I've learned working on this policy is that it gets really deep really fast. And people have a lot of questions. And if you talk to the right experts, you'll find out that we actually have a lot of answers to these questions, which is important. So the panelists I got for you today, first up, we've got Katrina Rourke. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Climate and Trade at the Climate Leadership Council. We've also got Sarah Stewart, who is the CEO and Executive Director at Silverado Policy Accelerator. And we've got Dave Banks, who is a bit of a jack of all trades. He's fellows at multiple think tanks, got experience in Congress and the White House. But let's get into the real meat of it. And a lot of the meat of this involves this concept of what has been called America's carbon advantage. Now, Katrina, you and all of your team at the Center for Climate and Trade at the Climate Leadership Council did a lot of thinking about this, a lot of research, and you put out a report on America's carbon advantage. Could you just walk us through that basic concept to set the stage for this whole conversation?
Thanks, Ann. I would be really glad to. I also want to thank Crest Forum for having us at National Clean Energy Week, and Zan for moderating our conversation, but also being a terrific partner on these issues. I'm excited for this conversation today. Okay, I love a good data story. I have a few slides to talk to you about this particular data story because it's hard to beat. We work a lot at the Climate Leadership Council with U.S. manufacturers, and we heard a lot from the manufacturers we work with that they are more carbon efficient than their international competitors. And we didn't have a terrific data tool to study those trends at all. So we worked to build one. And what I have for you here is the results of that new data tool that we developed. Across the economy, countries vary widely in the carbon intensity of production. That's the number one takeaway. That comes down to energy mix, industrial process choices, supply chains, a variety of other issues. But in this table, I'm offering you a summary of our findings for the carbon intensity of manufacturing by sector and by country, just for USMCA, the BRIC countries, the EU, and a global average, and you do not need to read it all. What I want you to look at is the color coding. Every red box is a sector in a country that requires more carbon emissions than the United States to create the same dollar of value to create comparable goods. Every blue box is a sector in a country that requires fewer carbon emissions to create comparable goods. White boxes about the same. You will note there are a lot of red boxes. The US is already leading the world at manufacturing goods with fewer carbon emissions than the global average, than many of our competitors. and manufacturers get no credit. There are no policies that reward cleaner manufacturers for their lower carbon emissions. There is no reward system for the capital-intensive investments required to achieve those lower carbon emissions, and that's something we can address with policy change. This is the economy-wide level. We've also worked to unpack this dynamic in a few carbon-intensive sectors for which we have data. I'll show you those now. We've studied the carbon intensity of bulk chemicals manufacturing. These are the building blocks of everything from the clothes we're wearing to the computers we're using for this panel. Most things you can touch on your desk, they come from bulk chemicals. The United States is an extremely carbon efficient manufacturer of bulk chemicals, especially compared to other major producers internationally. China, EU, and Saudi Arabia are our biggest competitors in this marketplace, and we're blowing them out of the water. A lot of that comes down to industrial process choices and the raw material supply that we're using in the chemicals sector. And then one more sector for which we've had data is the steel sector. The US is far and away the cleanest major manufacturer of steel in the world. Again, that comes down to choices made by domestic manufacturers. They rely on lower carbon energy sources, and American firms pioneered and invest the most in recycling steel to create new high quality product. That gives us a tremendous carbon advantage. That's it for the slides, but let's talk about why that matters. So if we figure out how to reward cleaner manufacturing in the international trading system, we're going to unlock a whole lot of value. Our analysis has demonstrated that trade policies that price emissions can generate new profits and increased sales from US industry, even from carbon intensive industries. So that's a climate motivated trade policy that creates new profits for incumbent firms. Okay, cool thing number one. The second thing is that we can cut global emissions. If US implements policies to get our imports to match our domestic carbon intensity, we're going to cut global emissions by 600 million tons. If we work with our G7 partners, so we all do the same, ensure that our imports match our domestic carbon intensities, we're cutting global emissions 1.8 million tons. That's 5% of global emissions just from these trading policies. And that's a huge value add for addressing the climate challenge. And then last, we're providing a counterbalance to authoritarian regimes. You may remember from my first slide that China and Russia require 3 to 4 times the amount of emissions than the US to create the same dollar of value. That's a huge additional source of emissions to create the same kinds of products. Many of those products Russia and China presently use for leverage in the international economy, and they know that they're exposed. So their own analysis has shown, Chinese analysis has shown that climate and trade policies can shrink Chinese GDP 0.64 percentage points and cost them 2.3 million jobs. Russia's oil czar has established that climate and trade policies can be more economically damaging than sanctions designed to be economically damaging. And so here we have a climate-motivated trade policy that can unlock new gains for American manufacturers, the global climate, and geopolitics. And that's a huge upside.
All right, so we're starting off with data, which I love, and then a list of 3 cool things. Who doesn't love lists of 3 cool things? Great start to this panel. Thank you, Katrina. You talked about the fact that the U.S. is making stuff that's cleaner, but currently not getting any reward for that. So let's start with that concept, and we'll work with there. Dave, I'm coming next to you because you, I think, have a really good understanding of the politics here. Whenever we're thinking about what a bipartisan policy would be, first we got to think about what's the policy that's good. We've got to think of, does the politics work? Is it something that actually can bring Republicans and Democrats together to do something? And I've heard you describe this in a really clever way, which is that this is the sort of policy where you get Trump's America First agenda intersecting with President Biden's Make It in America agenda. And I think that's a really interesting concept. So could you help us just understand what are the politics here? What are the strategic goals that can be achieved that are appealing to Democrats and Republicans?
Well, thanks, Zan. And by the way, Katrina did a really good job in identifying at least two of the main objectives here that I think Democrats and Republicans would be interested in, and that is obviously for Democrats, reducing global emissions, reining in global emissions. And by the way, I think that this is probably the only big policy that could actually drive emissions or accelerate the global deployment of low carbon technologies at the scale that, say, the Paris Agreement would suggest. Okay, that's needed to maintain control of global temperature increases. But then also Katrina her last point hit the geopolitics piece. And I think that for Democrats and Republicans, look, it's really, really, I can't say this enough. It's very, very rare to have a policy agenda that checks the boxes of so many different strategic objectives. Okay. So for Republicans, the geopolitical play, it would be, how do you, is this a policy that can help rein in Chinese influence over the global economy? The answer is yes. Okay. Is this a policy that can help restore key components of the supply chain? Yes. Right. Is this a policy that can help bolster U.S. manufacturing competitiveness, not only here at home, but also abroad? The answer is yes. And then I think for Democrats, the number one priority would be: is this a means to rein in global emissions at the scale we need to? And the answer is yes. So I think that this has produced a very interesting alignment of different folks across the political spectrum, from labor to environmental groups to industry to China hawks, folks who are really concerned about supply chain and economic security. So this, again, as a Republican who's worked on climate change policy for a long time, it's very exciting to see a policy that has so many climate benefits, but has the longevity needed and sustainability needed to cut across administrations, because it's not just about climate, it's about geopolitics and economic security. So that's the sweet spot for all this.
Thanks. And I want to pick up on a point you made, and Katrina mentioned it as well, is that we're talking about impacting global emissions. And that's really actually interesting and worth taking a second to talk about, because in the U.S. over the past several years, we've enacted a lot of legislation to reduce domestic emissions, and I think that's for a lot of people that's been very exciting. Other people didn't like the politics of all of it, but when you look back at the bipartisan infrastructure law, a lot of bipartisan investments in decarbonization. You look at the CHIPS and Science Act, a lot of bipartisan investments in decarbonization. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was a partisan effort, but many of those tax credits had their roots in bipartisan legislation. There's a lot of bipartisan support behind a lot of the investments that we're making in technology and infrastructure deployment in the U.S. But the real question is that enough? Decarbonizing the U.S., is that enough, or do we actually need to decarbonize globally if we want to affect climate change? And I think the answer to that is obvious. It's the global emissions that matter. And so I think it's really important that we're talking about a policy that's really looking at the global side of things. And since we're thinking globally, I want to move over to Sarah, because in National Clean Energy Week, I think we've got a lot of energy nerds here. And I say that lovingly. And you know a thing or two about energy as well, but you're actually a trade expert. And if we're talking about energy, climate, trade, it's probably good to have someone who knows their stuff about trade. So, when you're hearing people talk about these various types of ways to intersect trade policy with energy policy and climate policy, you're thinking about it from your trade lens. How does that work out? Do we have existing trade mechanisms in place that can be added upon or modified? How do you think about this from your trade lens?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that the short answer is yes. We do have a lot of existing tools, and yes, we still need to be thinking creatively about complementary additional tools. The trade and environment nexus is not new. That has been around for a while. Having spent a lot of time in multiple administrations at USTR, working on different free trade agreements for the Environment and Natural Resources Office, I can tell you that the intersection of trade and climate is relatively new. And that is I think, evolving conversation that we are hearing, not just here in the US, but really everywhere. So my challenge to everybody listening today is, if you're an energy nerd, go looking for a trade nerd. If you're a trade nerd, go looking for an energy nerd. Have a toast, get to know one another, because we've got to really start doubling down on merging these two disciplines so that we can get to a new or we can use the existing policies that we have and embrace a new policy. So I want to just talk briefly about some of the existing tools that we have. So there's probably three big buckets I would put them in. One being free trade agreements. While we don't have a lot of specific obligations in our US free trade agreements that say you need to cut emissions by X amount, we do have a lot of obligations in those trade agreements that help kind of get us towards decarbonization, whether it's USMCA, where we have called for North America harmonization of energy efficiency standards, or really any of our modern FTAs where all countries have to effectively enforce their environmental laws. We are bringing the force of a commercial trade policy to help bring about commitments on environment. And I think that this is a place that is probably the least understood when I'm talking to folks in the environment and energy space, because if you look at multilateral environmental agreements or even environmental policy, you typically don't see some type of commercial incentive or penalty, for lack of a better word, if you don't comply with whatever the environmental requirement is. And that's why trade is it's not the only tool, but it's an important one. So we have FTAs. We also have existing trade remedy tools like anti-dumping and countervailing duties that can help to level the playing field in certain sectors or for certain products. When we see unfair competition, we have not seen these tools used as much as I think that we could in the environmental space. So I think that's an area to watch. We also have, other tools like the global safeguards that were used in the solar industry. And then our third bucket, of course, is the World Trade Organization, where our existing agreements, give us a glide path, I think, towards addressing some new policies that deal with carbon and trade, such as, coming up with standards in particular sectors that could help with interoperability of measuring emissions in traded goods. So look, we have a lot of tools. We could probably enhance the tools that we have, but also think about whether there are new policies. Some of those we're already seeing, in legislative proposals in the US and beyond, that can help to hang all of these existing tools together and give us kind of a new trajectory.
Awesome. So maybe my favorite point that you just made is that we should make friends with either trade or energy people, depending on which one you're not. What is Clean Energy Week about if not making friends? I think that's a great place to start.
It's a call to action.
Call to action. Oh, I love it. Make friends. Right, everyone listening, you have a homework assignment now. The other point that I thought you made that is really important is about aligning incentives. Right, you want policies in place that align incentives to do the things that we want people to do, and for people to work together to achieve common goals. And I think that's a really, really great point. Towards the end of this conversation, we've still got plenty of time to go, but towards the end of this conversation, I'm going to try to bring in some questions from the audience. So this is just a reminder to everyone out there in the audience. If you have questions, feel free to submit them. I will try to work them in at the end. But in the meantime, I'm coming back to you, Katrina, because it all comes down to data, right? It all comes down to data. You laid out your carbon advantage report And that's research that you guys did and you worked on. But to my understanding, there's no official government data that has that sort of equivalent analysis on carbon intensities of specific products. But there is bipartisan legislation that would change that. Senator Kramer and Senator Coons have introduced the Prove It Act. Could you explain that bill, the Prove It Act, and why it's important?
Thanks, Dan. Yes, you are correct. There is no U.S. government data tracking these metrics. We have data. The OECD has started to think about data, but neither of these projects has data granular enough to give us a strong sense of how other countries are doing on a goods basis. And we don't trade sectors, we trade goods. So it would be nice to know how the US stacks up to our competitors on a goods basis. The Prove It Act would commission a study from the Department of Energy about the carbon intensity of production for 3 categories of goods: energy intensive goods, fuels, and decarbonization technologies like solar cells and inputs like critical minerals for the US and 36 other countries, major trading partners in the sectors that we care about. It also asks the DOE to identify where there are gaps in available emissions data. In other words, what data are we missing to better understand how our competitors are doing in terms of carbon intensity of manufacturing goods? Why is it important to have this data? A whole bunch of reasons. I think our data is strong, the data that I've already presented, but a specific goods level analysis conducted by the data crunching experts at DOE, that's going to be a huge help. It'll give us context for how the US stacks up and give us insights into why the US has a carbon advantage in specific sectors. That lets us tell the good news story of US decarbonization, lets us highlight the investments that American companies are making in decarbonizing their processes, implementing new technologies. I want to be able to tell that story better. It also helps us create a framework for evaluating emissions at a goods level. Our trading partners are already trying to develop this kind of emissions measurement and disclosure pathway. I want the US to develop it first. Our administrative processes, our data sharing processes are frankly superior. If we're taking the lead in this process, it's all going to work out better. The third reason is that it establishes a process for receiving data from private industry on a voluntary basis. Private industry is already trying to figure out how to measure emissions on a goods basis. This will open a platform for us to learn from them across sectors. I think that's really important to bring those data processes in. It also moves the US from policy taker to policy maker. I've alluded to other countries developing these kinds of emissions pathways, but the European Union is moving full steam ahead on their own climate and trade policy. Beginning October 1st, so 5 days from now, imports into the European Union in 5 categories of goods are going to have to disclose goods level emissions. If we're not developing our own emissions benchmarks to be responsive to that new European policy, then the Europeans are going to decide those benchmarks for us. I don't think that puts US industry in a favorable position. And then finally, it lets us push our partners. If we establish that the US is a leader in decarbonization, it helps us figure out how to engage international partners to push for global decarbonization, to change practices, to decarbonize energy supplies, and importantly, to highlight avenues where installing and operating US-made decarbonization technologies is going to help them achieve development, decarbonization, and industrialization goals. I think all of that is really important context. I do want to make one last point, which is that we already have this data for the US. We know what our carbon intensity looks like. We have data for industry level emissions. What we lack is the ability to compare US performance to our competitors. So this is not about equipping government with more data about US operations. This is about equipping policymakers and industry with more information about what the playing field looks like internationally. That's a huge gap in data right now.
Thanks. And there's a strange attack has arisen about the Prove It Act, which is trying to say that getting this data is the first step to a carbon tax. And whatever you think about a carbon tax, whether you're for it, against it, or ambivalent, it's the wrong data, right? This is not data that you would need to implement a domestic carbon tax. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not suitable for that role.
Yeah, connection's bad. All right. Am I back on? I had a bit of a blip there, I thought.
You're there.
So I'm going to move to the next question, which is to Dave. You and I work together. You and I work together at the Bipartisan Policy Center to write a report about the pros and cons of different ways to design a border carbon adjustment. You could do it based on a carbon tax, you could do it based on a regulatory regime, or you can do it based on an emissions performance standard, emissions intensity. And based on our report, we concluded that the best path forward in the near term is to focus on that third path, not the carbon tax, not the regulatory approach, but the emissions performance standard. And this idea has really caught on. We've seen legislation from Senator Whitehouse and Senator Cassidy that both use that basic idea. But there is a major point of friction. And this point of friction is this a policy that's going to apply new domestic regulations and something on imports, or is it only an import-focused policy? I don't know how far we got. Dave, did you answer my question about imports versus exports before things ended? I couldn't quite tell.
Yeah. No. Teasing.
Yes. Should I ask again? All right. So we're talking about this complicated trade policy here, and there's a point of friction. Some people are saying this should be a new policy that applies domestically and on imports, right? Like an emissions performance standard domestically and on imports.
Mm-hmm.
Other people say it should only be an imports-focused policy. We're focusing on imports because domestically we're already doing a lot of decarbonization. Can you talk a little bit about that friction and how Democrats and Republicans view it?
Yeah, and this might be a little provocative, right? But this is kind of where the politics rest. I mean, look, with Senator Whitehouse's bill, there's obviously a desire to create I don't want to call it an incentive, but a regulatory system that would help drive or accelerate emissions reductions domestically. Okay, I think that for Republicans, there's obviously staunch opposition to further regulation or to carbon pricing, whether it's upfront or kind of a backdoor approach. I would call this kind of a backdoor carbon pricing approach. So I don't see it going anywhere politically. But I think from a policy perspective, it really falls short. But because what we want to do, at least from a Republican perspective, and I think a lot of Democrats would agree on this goal as well, is that we want to create some type of international partnership particularly with our allies and partners, okay, to develop a common approach. Because quite frankly, the United States, from a geopolitical perspective, you're looking at that goal and reining in Chinese influence. We don't have the market power by ourselves to do that. So we have to internalize that fact. We need to work very closely and have a common approach with our allies and partners. And I think that if you were to try to use, let's call it the White House approach, where you're using carbon efficiency, but you have this domestic component, I think that really complicates the ability to build out the partnership with other countries, because the more complex your system is here, the more difficult it's going to be for other countries to replicate that same policy framework. So I'm a big proponent to just focus on the carbon efficiency of the product, right? And just use that as the metric to determine the trade policy design, that in and of itself.
All right, that makes sense. I've been told that my camera's no longer working, but my audio is. So I'm gonna just roll with that and be the voice from afar. And you're talking a little bit about this idea of whether or not there's a domestic component, and many people have brought up that piece of it as being particularly relevant for the WTO. And this is a thing that I hear all the time about this policy. What about the WTO? What about the WTO? Katrina, you guys just put out this new report that answers that question. Could you tell us about how the WTO might view various versions of this policy?
Dan, thank you for the question. I am really excited about this analysis. Most of the scholarship looking at what the WTO should think about these kinds of climate and trade policies is really narrowly focused on the scenario that Dave was just describing about having a domestic regime and then adding a border component. But I think that we've seen internationally the conversation evolving to look for more policy avenues than just that simple one. What other trade tools, if implemented, help us achieve these domestic industrial goals, these climate goals, these geopolitical goals? And they don't all fit neatly into having a domestic plan with a perfect corollary at the border. And so we recently released a report. It's available at clcouncil.org if you're interested, that examines the policy options on the table for introducing carbon accountability into the trading system broadly, and lays out potential legal defenses for each of these pathways at the WTO. So this isn't what the WTO will think, but these are the defenses that we're offering to support the development of these creative policies. And our number one finding is that every pathway presently in conversation has a potential defense that is firmly grounded in the text of our international trade agreements and WTO jurisprudence. So that includes these pathways that have a domestic component and a border component that are alike. That includes pathways that are pricing the carbon emissions associated with imported goods without a domestic component, or in some ways restricting trade in the most carbon intensive pathways. It includes policies that consider alignment with other countries also interested in implementing these tools. For example, the G7 is pursuing what they describe as an inclusive climate club. There are a number of avenues available for each of these policy options. So, broadly, if you comply with the letter of every agreement, you can walk in through what some call the front door of the WTO. You don't need to defend it. Everybody sees that it is in perfect alignment. That is unlikely to apply in these more creative cases. In that case, we need to rely on an exception. Often in conversation, we've heard of the environmental exception, that you say you need this policy to accomplish an environmental goal. That's one viable pathway. There are others. The essential security exception has been the justification for a variety of trade policies recently implemented by the Trump and Biden administrations. That's an important pathway that has not yet been explored in the climate space. But it's hard to think of a more pressing international emergency than climate change to try to address through trade policies. And we finally also explored an international commodities agreement. That's a more exotic kind of approach, but it allows countries to agree to new trade terms to govern trade in specific commodities. And it doesn't require as much of a justification as these other pathways. It allows countries to get really creative in working together to solve this problem. I will also point out that when we released the paper, we had a really terrific conversation with James Backus and Jennifer Hillman, two former members of the WTO appellate body from the United States. And while they may quibble with the specifics of our analysis, they broadly affirm that the WTO is interested in facilitating this conversation, is not interested in standing in the way. And so we can broadly say that working towards accomplishing new climate and trade policies is going to be something that is productive for opening up new trade in low carbon goods, in decarbonizing goods, and is not going to broadly run afoul of trade rules.
Thank you. And the other question that I hear most commonly is, okay, we're talking about emissions from China, talking about emissions from Russia. We got U.S. emissions, we got EU emissions, we got the big countries. What about the least developed countries? What about the countries that are kind of struggling to get their economies up and running? How would such a policy interact with them, or how should a policy be designed the best way possible to facilitate good trade relationships, good geopolitical relationships with those kinds of countries? I'm gonna turn this over to Sarah, but also if you have anything you want to add on the WTO while you're at it, feel free to do that as well.
Well, I 100% agree with the analysis that CLC put out and that the former appellate body members endorsed. I think we've got to think creatively and urgently. We we should be pursuing negotiations at the WTO, but that should not be our, we can't fool ourselves into thinking that we will reach multilateral agreement anytime soon. So we need to think about these policies. And I think that the existing rules, as Katrina laid out, give us a lot of latitude to come up with interoperable policies that recognize each other's systems as being comparable in effectiveness. And this is a really important point. So kudos on a great report. Look, on the least developed countries, I think you touched on this earlier, Zan. I mean, climate change knows no borders. So, having the US or the EU alone acting in this space without bringing in the rest of the world in some way, shape, or form is not going to cut it and not get to the level of cuts that we need. So I think about it again in threes. In three kind of buckets of ways that you could look at this. Number one is, you could exempt developing countries or least developing countries from any type of border carbon policy. This has some benefits for them. We've heard from developing countries that they feel like, they should not be, that these types of measures shouldn't apply because they haven't had as much time as developed countries to make the types of decarbonization cuts. They don't have access to the same amount of technology. But I think that this is a real oversight to do a full exemption because it doesn't actually incentivize any change and it doesn't get at the decarbonization. And I think that it can be done in a fair way that actually does achieve the objective. So the second is you could have broad application and you could have a border carbon scheme like the EU's that applies equally to everybody. Again, this has, the downside of if you treat developing countries and developed countries the same, you're overlooking the fact that there are distinct differences there and different needs and different levels of development. So I think that there's a third path. I'm calling it the under the tent with benefits path, where it's, a path for certain developing countries who show a real willingness to want to make decarbonization cuts to come into the fold, whether it's a unilateral unilateral border adjustment or some type of club that emerges out of all of these discussions where there are benefits and targeted technical assistance and aid and other things for these developing countries. So the types of things that you could envision might be, if you design this as a border fee, those fees could be collected and help, rather than going to the treasury of the imposing country, they could be used to procure the types of technology that these countries need in order to deepen the cuts. You could also see a path where you could start striking some deals to lower tariffs. The US clean technology market is the most open market in the world. We have nearly 0% or very low tariffs on our imports, but our US exports are facing enormous barriers to trade in the exact types of technologies that are inaccessible to many of these developing countries and would become more accessible if we could negotiate some better tariff deals that go along with, a framework where we're bringing developing countries in, giving them benefits, but also helping them to decarbonize and lower whatever liability may ensue. So,
all right.
Yeah.
So thank you. That was an excellent answer. And I just want to wrap. We've got 1 minute left. I'd hoped we'd have a little more time to talk about carbon clubs and a little bit more time to talk about kind of national security implications and supply chains. And I really wanted to talk a little bit about, what are the costs of not pursuing a policy like this? Sometimes people focus so much on like change is scary. What if something bad happens? What if we don't do anything? What's going to happen then? You guys are just a terrific panel. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties. This is exciting. It's complicated. Don't forget your homework assignment to make friends. Thank you, Crest Forum. And it's been such a great time being part of National Clean Energy Week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
you.